I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize it in the street.
When the state of Florida first announced its plan to fight one of the worst invasive species disasters in American history by deploying an army of specially trained animals into the swamp, most people didn't take it seriously. Late-night hosts joked about it. Local news anchors smirked through the segment. Online comment sections filled up with sarcasm about government agencies wasting taxpayer money on what sounded like a bad science fiction plot. Nobody expected it to work. And that's exactly why what happened next caught almost everyone off guard. To understand why Florida reached this point, you have to go back to a problem that started small, stayed quiet for years, and eventually grew into something almost impossible to control. The Everglades were never supposed to have giant constrictor snakes slithering through them. Burmese pythons are native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, thousands of miles away from South Florida. But starting in the 1970s, exotic pet dealers began importing them by the thousands, and buyers across the country fell in love with the idea of owning a snake that could grow longer than a car. The trouble was, almost nobody thought through what happens when a 5-foot hatchling turns into a 16-foot adult capable of swallowing a deer whole. Enclosures that seemed spacious for a baby snake became laughably small a few years later. Feeding costs ballooned. Owners who once bragged about their exotic pets started quietly looking for a way out. Some pythons escaped on their own. Others were deliberately released into the wetland surrounding Miami because dumping an unwanted 15-foot predator into a swamp seemed easier than finding it a new home. Then, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida and destroyed a commercial reptile breeding facility near the edge of the Everglades. Cages shattered. Fencing collapsed. An unknown number of pythons that had been kept for breeding and sale simply walked, or rather slithered, out into the wild. Nobody at the time understood the scale of what had just happened. The swamp had just been handed a founding population of apex predators with no natural enemies waiting for them. For years, the problem grew in the background, mostly unnoticed by the public. Pythons are ambush predators, built to disappear into tall grass and dense brush. Their skin pattern works like a living camouflage pattern, blending seamlessly into the dappled light of the wetlands. A snake could be lying 6 feet from a hiking trail and remain completely invisible to someone walking past. By the time researchers began taking the issue seriously, the python population had already exploded far beyond anything containable by hand. Wildlife biologists who study the Everglades started noticing something alarming in the early 2000s. Mammal populations that had once been common throughout the park were vanishing at a staggering pace. Researchers running nighttime road surveys, counts that had reliably turned up raccoons, opossums, rabbits, and foxes for decades, suddenly found almost nothing. In areas where pythons had become established the longest, raccoon sightings dropped by more than 90%. Opossum populations fell by similarly devastating margins. Bobcat sightings became rare. White-tailed deer, once a common presence in the park, all but disappeared from entire sections of the wetlands. It wasn't a slow decline. It was a collapse, and it traced almost perfectly to the spread of the pythons. The math behind why this happened is straightforward and unsettling. A single female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a clutch, sometimes more. With no natural predators in Florida capable of threatening a full-grown python, and with an abundant supply of native mammals that had never evolved defenses against this kind of ambush hunter, the snakes had walked into a paradise. Estimates on the total python population in the Everglades vary widely because the animals are so difficult to detect, but wildlife agencies have cited figures ranging from tens of thousands to as many as several 100,000 individual snakes spread across South Florida's wetlands. That range alone tells you something important. When an invasive species becomes so numerous and so well hidden that scientists can't even agree on an order of magnitude, traditional control methods stop being useful. You can't trap your way out of a problem you can't even measure. Florida's first instinct was the obvious one: pay people to go find and remove the snakes. The state authorized bounty programs and later formalized a paid contractor system, sending licensed python removal agents out into designated stretches of public land across Miami-Dade, Broward, Collier, and several other counties. Hunters were compensated per foot of snake removed, with bonuses for larger specimens and for females carrying eggs, since removing a breeding female effectively prevents dozens of future snakes from ever hatching. The program produced real, measurable results. Over time, hunters working under the state's removal initiative accounted for thousands of pythons taken out of the ecosystem, with the running tally climbing into the many thousands over the years the program has operated. Florida also began hosting an annual public hunting competition open to anyone willing to register, offering cash prizes for the most snakes caught and the longest specimens brought in. The event drew hunters from across the country, generated national headlines, and turned python removal into something resembling a sport. But even with hundreds of participants and paid professionals working the wetlands year-round, the humans were only ever scratching the surface. Pythons are extraordinarily difficult to locate visually. Their coloring lets them vanish into sawgrass, leaf litter, and shadow. Studies conducted by wildlife researchers estimated that a person walking directly past a python in dense habitat might have less than a 1 in 5 chance of ever seeing it. Multiply that limitation across an ecosystem spanning thousands of square miles, and it becomes clear why the population kept growing even as removal numbers climbed. Florida wasn't losing the fight because people weren't trying. It was losing because human eyesight was never going to be enough. That is the moment researchers started looking for help that didn't rely on eyesight at all. If a human couldn't reliably spot a python hiding in the grass, maybe the solution wasn't a better set of eyes. Maybe it was a better nose. Working with Auburn University's Canine Detection Research Institute, wildlife researchers began adapting a training program originally built for explosive detection dogs and repurposing it for conservation work. The idea sounded almost absurd at first. These were animals that had been evaluated for careers sniffing out bombs, and some of them had washed out of that program simply because their personalities were too energetic, too food-driven, or too easily distracted indoors to make good explosives dogs. It turned out those exact same traits made them extraordinary in an open, chaotic outdoor environment like the Everglades. Handlers trained the dogs to recognize the specific scent signature of Burmese python skin and to alert their handler by sitting and pointing their nose toward the source once they picked it up. In controlled field trials, the dogs succeeded in locating hidden pythons somewhere between 3/4 and over 90% of the time, a wildly higher detection rate than anything achievable through visual searching alone. Just as importantly, they covered ground far faster than a human search team, moving in wide sweeping patterns through terrain that would take a person hours to traverse carefully on foot. Florida's state wildlife agency eventually built its own dedicated detector dog unit, training Labrador retrievers using python-scented towels and previously captured snakes fitted with tracking devices to reinforce the target scent. The dogs were taught to keep a safe distance once they located a snake, allowing trained handlers to move in and safely remove the animal rather than risking a direct encounter themselves. It was strange, it looked unconventional, and when word first got out that Florida was training bomb-sniffing washouts to hunt 15-foot constrictor snakes, plenty of people treated it as a punchline. But the dogs delivered results the human hunters simply could not match on their own, uncovering snakes tucked into terrain that had been searched by people just days earlier and turned up nothing. If the detector dogs sounded unusual, the next tool Florida deployed sounded almost like betrayal, because in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Researchers at the University of Florida developed a method that turned captured pythons into informants against their own kind. The technique became known as the Judas Snake Program, named for the biblical figure who betrayed someone close to him. Wildlife biologists surgically implanted radio transmitters into captured male pythons and then released those same snakes back into the wild, tracking their movements remotely. The logic behind the method exploits basic python biology. During breeding season, male pythons are driven to seek out females, often traveling long distances and gathering in what researchers call breeding aggregations, locations where multiple snakes converge around a single receptive female. A tagged male released back into the Everglades will, without knowing it, lead researchers directly to these gathering points. Track one Judas snake long enough, and instead of finding one python, a team might find 4, 5, or more clustered together in a single location. The approach proved remarkably effective at targeting exactly the animal's removal efforts most needed to reach. A single roaming male might reveal the location of several breeding-age females in one outing, each of which could otherwise have produced dozens of hatchlings that season. Researchers leading the program acknowledged from the outset how strange the concept sounded, deliberately releasing a snake back into a national park specifically because that snake would betray its own species. But the trade-off made sense on paper. One tagged male doing this work repeatedly over a season could account for the removal of far more pythons than the same amount of effort spent on random ground searches. Between the dogs working the surface and the Judas snakes working from the inside, Florida had assembled something closer to an intelligence network than a traditional hunting operation. None of this rolled out smoothly in the court of public opinion. When details of these programs first circulated more widely, plenty of people reacted with disbelief bordering on mockery. The idea of a state government spending money training former bomb-sniffing dogs to chase snakes, combined with surgically implanting tracking devices into captured predators and releasing them back into a national park on purpose, struck a lot of casual observers as the kind of decision only a cartoon government agency would make. Social media commentary leaned hard into the absurdity. Comparisons to science fiction plots were common. Some critics argued the money spent developing these programs would have been better used expanding the human hunter workforce or funding habitat restoration elsewhere. Others simply couldn't get past the mental image of a Labrador retriever employed as a professional python detective, or a snake wearing an internal tracking chip working, unknowingly, for the very agency trying to eliminate its species. The skepticism wasn't entirely unreasonable on the surface. Wildlife management agencies had tried plenty of unconventional ideas over the decades that ultimately produced underwhelming results. There was no guarantee these particular experiments would be any different. And the imagery involved dogs and betrayer snakes as the new front line against an invasive species crisis was undeniably strange enough to invite jokes. What critics underestimated was how much data had already been quietly gathered before either program was ever announced publicly. These weren't improvised stunts. They were built on years of behavioral research into how pythons move, breed, and evade detection, developed by biologists who had spent careers studying exactly this species. The mockery came from people encountering the headline for the first time. The programs themselves had been refined well before that headline ever existed. The turning point in public perception didn't happen all at once. It built gradually, as removal statistics from the detector dog units and the Judas snake tracking program began accumulating alongside the more traditional hunter-based totals. Individual detector dogs proved capable of locating pythons that had already evaded human searchers working the same ground days earlier, snakes tucked so deeply into brush that visual detection would have required essentially stepping directly on top of them. Field trials comparing dog-assisted searches against human-only searches consistently showed the dogs covering significantly more ground in less time while maintaining a far higher success rate at actually finding a hidden snake. The Judas snake program produced results that were, in their own way, even more striking. Rather than removing pythons one at a time through chance encounters, researchers following tagged males were able to locate entire breeding aggregations in a single outing, sometimes pulling multiple large females out of the population during a single tracking excursion. Because female pythons are the ones directly responsible for each season's new generation of hatchlings, removing them during breeding season carries an outsized impact on future population growth compared to removing snakes at random. None of this eliminated the python problem. Nobody working on these programs ever claimed it would. The scale of the invasion, likely numbering well into six figures across the Everglades ecosystem, is simply too large for any combination of methods to fully reverse in the near term. But the combined approach, human hunters covering broad territory, detector dogs finding what human eyes missed, and Judas snakes exposing breeding hotspots that would otherwise have gone completely undetected, represented the most effective strategy Florida had assembled since the crisis began. Removal totals climbed into the tens of thousands of pythons taken out of the wild once every method was counted together, a number that would have been unreachable through any single approach on its own. Here is the part that tends to surprise people once they actually learn how these programs work. The mockery online largely treated the whole plan as a wasteful, almost comedic overreach, government bureaucracy dreaming up an expensive, ridiculous-sounding scheme with little real payoff. The reality turned out to be closer to the opposite. These programs were not blind experimentation. They were carefully engineered responses to a documented, measurable failure of conventional methods, built by researchers who understood python behavior at a level most critics commenting from the sidelines never considered. The detector dogs weren't a gimmick. They were a direct, practical solution to a well-documented visual detection problem that had limited every previous removal effort. The Judas snakes weren't some strange stunt for headlines. They were a targeted exploitation of breeding behavior designed specifically to reach the animals doing the most damage to future population growth. Neither program promised a total victory, and neither one delivered one. But both delivered exactly what they were designed to deliver: access to pythons that would otherwise have remained completely invisible to every method Florida had tried before. The Everglades python crisis is nowhere close to solved. Researchers are candid about that. The snakes are too numerous, too well hidden, and too well adapted to their new home for any single strategy to finish the job outright. But the story of how Florida responded, quietly building a detection network out of retrained working dogs and turning captured predators into unwitting informants against their own species, is a reminder that the ideas that sound the most ridiculous from the outside are sometimes the ones built on the most careful science underneath. The people laughing at the headline usually weren't the ones who had spent years in the field watching every other method come up short. Sometimes the strangest sounding plan isn't the desperate one. It's the one built by the people who understood the problem best.